Mommy, why doesn't Daddy live with us? Lena Martinez froze mid-step, a laundry basket balanced against her hip, her breath catching somewhere between her throat and her chest. She stood in the narrow hallway of her tiny studio apartment, the one with the cracked baseboard heater and the window that never closed all the way, and she looked down at her daughter. Mia was 3 years old. 3 years old, with big brown eyes the size of whole worlds and a bottom lip that trembled when life confused her. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor in her favorite yellow pajamas, the ones with the faded ducks on them, holding her stuffed bear to her chest like it might run away if she let go. Lena set the basket down slowly. She knelt in front of her daughter and tucked a curl behind the little girl's ear. Her hand was steady. Her heart was not. "Baby," she said softly, "some families are different. And our family, it's just us two. But us two." She tapped Mia's nose gently. "We're a whole world. You and me." Mia considered this with the deep seriousness that only a 3-year-old can summon. Then she nodded once, pressed her cheek against her stuffed bear, and said, "Okay, Mommy." Just like that. "Okay, Mommy." As if she'd filed it away somewhere in that tiny heart of hers. Not resolved, just tucked aside for later. Lena held it together until Mia looked away. Then she pressed her lips together, blinked hard twice, and picked the laundry basket back up. Because that's what you do. That's what single mothers do at 6 in the morning when the rent is due, and the day hasn't even started, and your 3-year-old just asked you the one question you will never have a clean answer to. She had been doing this alone for 3 years. Her parents, well-meaning in their own suffocating way, had pushed her into a marriage she hadn't chosen. She had been 23. He had been charming in the way that some broken things look beautiful from a distance. She had tried to believe in it. She had tried so hard. And then she'd found out she was pregnant, and the man she had married had looked at her across the kitchen table one quiet Tuesday evening and told her he didn't want this. Any of this. Her. The baby. The life they'd been constructing together out of obligation and pretense. He'd signed the papers before she'd even started to show. So Mia had come into the world with one parent. And that parent, Lena, had spent every day since then making sure her daughter never once felt like she was missing something. Even when the money was thin. Even when the nights were long. Even when Lena herself lay awake at 2 in the morning staring at the ceiling, feeling the particular loneliness that has no name but every single mother on earth knows by heart. And now she had a new job. It wasn't glamorous. It was never going to be glamorous. But it paid better than the diner, and it had steady hours, and the agency had told her the position came with a small staff apartment on the 3rd floor of the property, which meant no more $60 commute, which meant Mia could come with her, and the on-site daycare center was included. She was going to be a live-in housekeeper. For Adrienne Cole. She had Googled the name the night before because of course she had. And what came back was overwhelming was an understatement. Adrienne Cole, 35. CEO of Cole Industries. One of the youngest self-made billionaires in the country. On the cover of Forbes twice before he was 30. Cold, according to every profile. Demanding, according to every former employee interview she could find buried in business publications. One journalist had called him a man who runs his empire the way an ice shelf runs a coastline, silently, completely, and without any warmth whatsoever. Lena had read that sentence twice, and then closed her laptop. She'd said a quiet prayer, gotten Mia fed and dressed, and arrived at the Cole mansion on a crisp October morning with her daughter on her hip and her chin up. The house it wasn't a house. A house is something people live in. This was a structure of architectural intention. 6,000 square feet of steel and glass and deliberate silence, set behind iron gates and surrounded by grounds so perfectly maintained they looked almost fake. Like a movie set built to suggest wealth, so extreme it had looped all the way around into loneliness. The head of household staff, a composed woman named Mrs. Hargrove, met them at the service entrance and walked Lena through the expectations with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done this many times and expected to do it many times more. The previous housekeeper, she mentioned without particular emotion, had passed away suddenly. A cardiac event. 3 weeks ago. Lena said she was sorry. Mrs. Hargrove said, "Mr. Cole values punctuality, discretion, and silence.
He does not make small talk.
He does not require small talk. He will not notice you if you do your job correctly. That is the goal. To not be noticed." Lena nodded. Mia, balanced on her mother's hip, looked around the enormous entryway with wide eyes. She studied the high ceilings, the cold marble floors, the grand staircase curving upward like a statement. Then she looked at a large oil painting on the wall, a dark, abstract thing that probably cost more than Lena's car, and she pointed at it and said, loudly and with great conviction, "Ugly." Lena closed her eyes. Mrs. Hargrove blinked, and from somewhere at the top of the staircase, a voice, low,
Flat.
utterly unimpressed. "Who let a child into my house?" Lena opened her eyes and looked up. Adrian Cole stood at the top of the staircase in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of her previous salary, holding a coffee mug, staring down at them with the expression of a man who has just discovered an inconvenient weather event has occurred inside his foyer. He wasn't what she'd expected. The pictures hadn't. The pictures didn't quite capture the stillness of him. The way he stood like he was the most permanent thing in any room he occupied.
His jaw was set.
His eyes were dark and completely unreadable. He looked, Lena thought, like a man who had decided a very long time ago that feelings were a liability he couldn't afford. He looked, in short, like a man who was deeply, profoundly alone. And Mia, little Mia, 3 years old in her duck pajamas because Lena hadn't had time to change her, looked up at him from her mother's arms. And she didn't flinch. She didn't hide her face. She looked up at this cold, imposing man at the top of his grand staircase, and she studied him for a long, quiet moment. And then she said, softly, like she was saying something she'd known for a while, but was only just now finding the words for, "Daddy." The word landed in the marble foyer, like a stone dropped into still water. Adrian Cole's jaw tightened. Something moved behind his eyes, fast, like a shadow crossing a wall, and then it was gone. He turned and walked away without a word. But his coffee mug, Lena noticed, stayed on the railing. He'd set it down. Adrian Cole had not always been made of stone.
He knew that.
He remembered distantly the way he used to be, or the way he might have been if things had gone differently. If his father hadn't measured every childhood achievement against a ledger of financial return. If his mother hadn't left when he was 9, quietly and without drama, the way someone clears a table after a meal they didn't enjoy. If the one woman he had ever allowed himself to love hadn't looked at him at 31 and told him she couldn't do this anymore, the silence, the walls, the way he held everything at a distance, like the world was a room he was watching through glass. He had responded to that conversation the way he responded to every setback. He had cataloged it, absorbed it, and kept moving. He ran a $15 billion company. He had homes on 3 continents. He had a chef, a driver, a security team, and now, apparently, a housekeeper who came with a small, alarmingly confident toddler who had called him daddy on her first morning in his house.
He did not think about that.
He told himself he did not think about that. He was in his home office by 7, which was normal. He had 3 calls by 9, which was normal. He ate lunch at his desk and did not taste it, which was normal. He did everything the way he always did everything, efficiently, completely, and without any unnecessary humanity bleeding through the margins. And then, At 10:30 in the morning, while he was reviewing a contract on his second monitor, his office door swung open. Not knocked.
Swung.
He looked up. Mia Martinez stood in the doorway of his private office in a tiny pair of red overalls and a white shirt with a strawberry on it. Her hair was in two uneven pigtails. She was holding a crayon drawing in both hands, purple and yellow and red, completely abstract, the kind of artwork that means everything to the person who made it and requires significant generosity of spirit from everyone else. She walked across his office with the purposeful confidence of someone who had been invited, which she had not been. She stopped in front of his desk. She looked up at him. She placed the drawing on top of his contract.
For you, she said.
Adrian looked at the drawing. He looked at the child. He said, in the tone he used for contractors who missed deadlines, "How did you get in here?"
Door, she said simply.
"This office is off limits." "What's off limits?" He stared at her. She stared back. She had the most extraordinarily direct gaze he had ever encountered in a human being of any age. She wasn't scared of him. Most adults were at least mildly intimidated by Adrian Cole. This 3-year-old regarded him with a calm, assessing look of someone deciding whether to adopt a stray. "It means," he said carefully, "that you are not supposed to be in here." She considered this. "Why?" "Because I work in here." She looked around the office, the shelves of binders, the 2 monitors, the stark gray walls he'd never bothered to decorate. She looked back at him. "It's sad in here," she announced. Something moved in his chest. He ignored it. "Go find your mother," he said. She didn't move immediately. She looked at the drawing she'd placed on his desk, then back at him, as if checking whether he understood that it was a gift and gifts required a response. "Do you like it?" she asked. He opened his mouth. He intended to say something dismissive, something final, something that would establish clearly and kindly that this was not a relationship he was available for, that he was not a man who accepted crayon drawings, that the appropriate professional boundary between employer and 3-year-old guest was significant and needed to be respected. What came out was, "It's colorful." Mia beamed. Full, complete, total sunshine, the kind of smile that reorganizes the air in a room. "That's you," she said, pointing to a vaguely rectangular purple shape in the corner of the drawing. "And that's Mommy. And that's me." She pointed to 2 yellow shapes. "We're a family," she said, with the easy certainty of someone stating a fact that has always been true. Then she turned around and walked out of his office. He sat there for a long moment. He did not throw the drawing away. He told himself it was because he hadn't gotten around to it yet. He slid it under a folder on the corner of his desk, so he didn't have to look at it. But he didn't throw it away. That week, he became quietly aware of Mia in the way you become aware of weather, not always directly looking at it, but always knowing it's there. She had a way of appearing. In the kitchen while he poured his morning coffee, sitting on the counter watching him with those enormous eyes. In the hallway when he came downstairs, her little fingers wrapped around a banister post, studying him the way children study things they've decided they want to understand. She never demanded attention. She simply offered it. Freely. Without condition or expectation. She found him eating dinner alone in the dining room one evening, which was every evening, and she stood in the doorway and said, "That's too big a table for one person." He said, "I'm aware." She said, "Me and Mommy eat on the couch. It's better." He didn't respond. She said, "You could come." He said, "I'm fine." She studied him for another long moment, and then she said something that stripped the skin off the moment entirely, in the guileless, nuclear way that only children can manage. "You look lonely." He set his fork down. He said, more quietly than he intended, "I said I'm fine." She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said. And she left. But the next morning there was a second crayon drawing slipped under his office door. This one had a figure sitting at a very large table, and next to the large table a smaller table with 3 people around it. There was an arrow drawn between them, in careful, crooked crayon, pointing from the large empty table toward the small, full one. He stood in his doorway and looked at it for a long time. He picked it up. He put it in the folder with the first one. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about walls that took years to build. They don't come down in a moment. They come down the way frost leaves a window in the morning. Gradually. Reluctantly. In pieces so small you almost convince yourself it isn't happening at all. Lena watched it happen, and she wasn't sure whether to be relieved or terrified. She kept her head down and did her job. She was good at it. She was good at being invisible, at anticipating what a room needed before it needed it, at moving through a house quietly enough that the house didn't notice her. She was exactly the kind of employee Mrs. Hargrove had described: efficient, discreet, unremarkable. She was also aware, in the careful way of a woman who had been burned before, that Adrian Cole was a man she needed to keep at arm's length. He was her employer. He was worlds away from everything she was. And he was, even she had to admit this, watching him some mornings through the kitchen doorway, more human than the magazine profiles suggested. Alone in a way that had nothing to do with being lonely by accident and everything to do with being lonely by choice. She didn't let herself think about that. She focused on Mia. But Mia, as Mia tended to do, had her own plans. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Lena was folding laundry in the staff room and Mia was supposed to be napping.
Supposed to be.
Instead, Lena looked up to find her daughter gone, the little cot empty, the door ajar. Her heart rate jumped, and she went room by room until she found Mia in the main living room, sitting on the cold marble floor next to Adrian Cole's armchair, playing with a set of wooden blocks, chatting with the absolute conversational ease of someone at a dinner party they'd been personally invited to. Adrian was in the armchair. His laptop was open on his knee. He was not working. He was watching Mia build a tower with a careful, contained attention he probably didn't realize was visible on his face. Lena stood in the doorway. "She just walked in," he said, without looking up. His voice had that practiced neutrality in it. "I told her to go back to her room. She doesn't really take direction from people she's decided she likes," Lena said carefully. A pause. He looked up then, briefly, and something moved across his expression that wasn't quite a smile, and wasn't quite annoyance, and was, in fact, neither of those things. It was something softer. Something he reclaimed almost instantly. "The tower fell," Mia announced sadly, gesturing at the scattered blocks. "Build it again," Lena told her. "You have to help," Mia said, and looked directly at Adrian when she said it. A beat of silence. And Adrian Cole, billionaire, CEO, the man who ran his empire like an ice shelf ran a coastline, set his laptop on the side table, leaned forward, and picked up a block. Lena left before she did something embarrassing, like cry. From that point, it was small things. It was always small things. She noticed he started coming down to the kitchen 10 minutes later than usual in the mornings, right around the time Mia was having her breakfast. She noticed that the volume on his work calls dropped when Mia was napping. She noticed that when Mia left a toy in the hallway, he stepped over it instead of moving it aside the way he'd once told her, firmly, that staff belongings needed to be confined to staff quarters. She noticed he never moved the crayon drawings from his desk. She said nothing, because what was there to say? This man was not in her life. This man was her employer. She kept her head down and did her job and refused to read anything into anything because she was 27 years old and she had learned at a cost she was still paying that reading meaning into a man's behavior was a road with no good destination. But Mia had no such restraint. Mia had no restraint of any kind. One afternoon, Lena was cleaning the upstairs hallway when she heard her daughter's voice drifting up from the first-floor study, clear as a bell, saying, "My mommy is sad sometimes. But she doesn't cry in front of me because she doesn't want me to worry. But I hear her at night." Lena put down her cleaning cloth. She stood very still. She heard nothing from Adrian, just a silence that had a different quality to it than his usual silence. A listening silence. Then Mia said, "Are you sad too?" Lena pressed herself against the wall and closed her eyes. His voice, when it came, was low and rough-edged in a way she'd never heard it before, sometimes. "Why?" Another silence. Longer.
"I don't know," he said.
And the way he said it, like the admission had come out without permission, like he'd been carrying it so long he'd forgotten it was even there, nearly broke Lena in half. She gathered herself. She walked downstairs with careful, even footsteps. She collected her daughter with a quiet apology to Adrian. He didn't respond. He was looking out the window, his jaw tight, his profile cut hard against the afternoon light. But when they reached the doorway, he said, not turning around, "She doesn't need to apologize for anything she says." Lena turned back to look at him. He was still facing the window.
"She's just honest," he said.
"It's fine." Lena looked at this man. This closed, defended, achingly isolated man who had apparently just been cracked open very slightly by a 3-year-old with wooden blocks and an unfiltered mouth. "She gets that from her father," Lena said quietly. "The only good thing she got from him." He turned then, looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly 1 second longer, then was professional. Then she took Mia's hand and walked away. November settled over the Cole mansion like a held breath. Mia's birthday was the 14th. Lena had known it was coming the way a difficult conversation is coming, with a dull, persistent awareness that sits in your stomach and doesn't leave. She had been saving. She'd set aside $40 from the last 3 paychecks, which sounds like nothing until you understand that $40 is never nothing when you're doing it on a single income with rent and groceries and a 3-year-old who outgrows shoes every 2 months. She had planned something small. A cupcake with a candle. A wrapped gift. A little art kit she'd found on sale, because Mia loved to draw, had always loved to draw, left her artwork everywhere she went like a trail of bright evidence that she had been there, that she was here, that she was full of color even when the world around her was not. She had planned small because small was what she had. But Mia, the morning of her birthday, woke up with her whole heart open and her expectations enormous. She woke up believing, the way 3-year-olds believe in things with their entire bodies, that today was going to be magic. She had told every person she encountered in the last 2 weeks that her birthday was coming. She had told Mrs. Hargrove. She had told the grocery delivery man. She had told Adrian, twice, with great seriousness, as if she was giving him advance notice of an important calendar event he needed to prepare for. She woke up in her little cot in the staff apartment and sat straight up and announced to the ceiling, "I'm bigger now." Lena smiled from across the room. "You are, baby. Happy birthday." Mia scrambled out of bed and held her arms out to be lifted. Lena lifted her, and Mia looked at her mother with those enormous eyes, wide and bright, and full of something that was half joy and half the fragile, trembling edge of hope. "Is there a party?" she asked. Lena held her tighter. "We're going to have our own little party. Just us." Mia was quiet for a moment. "No other people?" "Just us, my love." Another quiet moment. "No decorations?" "I have a cupcake with a candle," Lena said softly. Mia's face, it didn't crumple all at once. It was slow. The way a small child's face falls when they understand something they weren't quite ready to understand yet. Her bottom lip went first, then her chin. Then her eyes filled up, those big brown eyes that Lena would walk through fire for, and the tears came quietly, not dramatically, not performatively, just real, just the silent, honest grief of a little girl who had wanted something and was learning, a little earlier than she should have had to, that wanting and having are sometimes very different things. "I wanted a party," she whispered, "with balloons and a cake." And she stopped, pressed her face against her mother's neck. Her small body shook once. And then she said it, the thing that broke Lena completely open. "I wanted a daddy to sing to me." Lena couldn't speak. She held her daughter and pressed her lips to her hair and closed her eyes and breathed. Just breathed, because sometimes that's all you can do. Sometimes the only available response to your child's pain is to hold them and be steady and refuse to fall apart in front of them even when you are falling apart in every direction on the inside. "I love you so much," Lena whispered into her hair. So much, my sweet girl. I love you enough for 100 daddies." Mia held on. She didn't say anything else for a long moment. She just cried, quietly, in her mother's arms, on the morning of her 3rd birthday, in a staff apartment on the 3rd floor of a billionaire's mansion. And at the end of the hallway, leaning in the doorway he had walked past on his way downstairs for coffee, Adrian Cole stood completely still. He had heard everything, every single word. He stood there for a long time after the crying had quieted. He stood there with his coffee mug cold in his hand and something happening in his chest that he didn't have words for, because he had spent 15 years systematically eliminating the vocabulary of feeling from his internal language. But he knew what it was. He had always known what it was. It was the specific, undeniable pain of recognizing loneliness in someone else, the loneliness of a 3-year-old girl who wanted to be celebrated, who wanted to be loved in the complete way children deserve to be loved, who had asked for so little and was still going to receive less than that. He turned around. He picked up his car keys. He walked out the front door without telling anyone where he was going. He had never been inside a toy store. This was not as strange as it sounded. He had no children, no nieces or nephews, no siblings to speak of. His was the kind of family that had long since scattered into its individual components and stopped pretending to be a unit. Christmas gifts, when they happened at all, were handled by his assistant. Birthday gifts, the rare occasions when he acknowledged a birthday at all, were gift cards, bank transfers, the clinical efficiency of a man who had outsourced warmth so completely he'd forgotten what it felt like to perform it himself. He stood in the entrance of the toy store and looked around. It was a lot, bright and loud and stuffed to the ceiling with color. There were children everywhere, which was disorienting. Small ones, large ones, ones running and ones crying and ones standing with their noses pressed against glass display cases with a focused intensity of miniature art critics. The whole place smelled like plastic and something sweet he couldn't identify. A staff member in a bright yellow vest approached him with the particular alertness of someone who had just spotted a man in a $3,000 suit looking mildly overwhelmed in the board game aisle. "Can I help you find something?" "I need a birthday gift," he said. "For a 3-year-old girl." "Sure. What is she like?" He thought about it. He thought about Mia sitting cross-legged on his marble floor, building towers out of wooden blocks and talking about her mother's sadness with the clear-eyed acceptance of a child who has decided that love is bigger than grief. He thought about the crayon drawings. He thought about the way she'd looked at his dining room table and called it too big for one person. He thought about the way she'd looked up at him on her first morning in his house and said, "Daddy?" Soft as a prayer, certain as gravity. "She likes color," he said. "And she's brave. She's very brave for her size." The staff member smiled and walked him through the store. He saw dolls, which he rejected. He saw art sets. He paused at those, remembering what Lena had said about her getting her honesty from her father, but then he moved on. He saw stuffed animals, toy kitchens, miniature workbenches, a whole aisle of things that lit up and beeped and demanded batteries. And then he stopped. At the end of an aisle, beneath a display banner that said Ride and Grow, there was a tricycle.
Red.
Cherry red. Bright and solid, and exactly the right size for a 3-year-old. It had a little white basket on the front with a plastic daisy on it. It had a bell on the handlebar. It had streamers coming off the grips, red and white and yellow, curling outward like tiny celebrations.
He looked at it.
He thought about Mia's face, the way she'd looked on the morning he'd just left, her face pressed against her mother's neck, her little body shaking with the specific grief of a child who wanted so little and felt the absence of it so completely. He said, "That one." He bought it without asking the price, which was unusual even for him. He was not a man who bought things without looking at the numbers. But the numbers didn't matter. The numbers had never mattered less in his entire business career. At the register, the cashier asked if he wanted it gift-wrapped, and he said yes. Then he changed his mind. He didn't want anyone else wrapping it. He didn't entirely know why. It felt important. It felt like something he needed to do himself. So he bought a roll of birthday wrapping paper. It had balloons on it, because of course it did, and a bow, and he took the box to his car, and he sat in the parking lot of the toy store, and he wrapped that tricycle box with the methodical, imperfect hands of a man who had never wrapped a gift in his adult life. It took 3 attempts. The corners were not clean. The bow was slightly off-center. He sat back and looked at it. It was, objectively, not well wrapped. He didn't care. He drove home. He carried the box in through the front door himself, declining the driver's offer to help. He stood in the foyer for a moment, the box in his arms, and he heard from somewhere upstairs the sound of Mia's voice. She was singing, the way small children sing when they don't know anyone is listening, small and sweet and completely unself-conscious, and something in his chest shifted. Something that had been in one position for a very long time. He climbed the stairs. He knocked on the staff apartment door. He never came up here. This was not a part of the house he had any reason to visit. It was small and clean, and Lena had put a little string of paper stars above Mia's cot, cut from old paper bags, hand-painted yellow, and the sight of them stopped him in the doorway with a weight he didn't have a word for. Lena opened the door and stared at him. She looked at him. She looked at the badly wrapped box in his arms. She looked at his face. Something moved through her expression. Surprise, confusion. Something softer underneath that she immediately tried to put away. "Mr. Cole." "Where is she?" he said. A pause. She's just inside. She had a hard morning. Her voice was careful, measured, the voice of a woman choosing every word like she's walking across ice. He nodded once. He stood in the doorway with the box. Mia appeared from behind her mother's legs. She had been crying. Her eyes were still puffy, her cheeks still blotched pink. She was in her yellow duck pajamas still, because today had been hard enough that getting dressed hadn't happened yet. She had her stuffed bear under one arm, and her hair was coming out of her pigtails. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. For a moment, just a moment, something enormous and inarticulate moved through Adrian Cole's chest. This small, brave, heartbroken little girl who had walked into his house and into his office and into his life without permission or apology, who had put crayon drawings on his contracts, who had told him he looked lonely and then, impossibly, done something about it, who had called him daddy on her very first morning because something in her 3-year-old soul had recognized something in him, some need, some absence, some hollow space that had been empty so long he'd stopped knowing it was there. He crouched down to her level. He held out the box. "Happy birthday, Mia," he said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. He cleared his throat. "I heard that you wanted something to celebrate." She looked at the box. She looked at him. Her bottom lip trembled, not with sadness this time, with something else, with the overwhelming, full-body sensation of being seen, of being thought of someone deciding that your happiness mattered enough to do something about it. "For me," she whispered. "For you," he confirmed. She looked at her mother. Lena had both hands pressed to her mouth, and her eyes were very bright. Mia looked back at him. Then she reached out her hands. He placed the box in them, or rather, he helped her hold it because it was too big for her to manage alone. Together they set it on the floor. And he watched while Mia attacked that imperfect wrapping paper with absolute, joyful destruction, tearing through it with both hands, that beautiful laugh coming up out of her, the one that sounded like bells and running water. When the box was open and she saw the red tricycle, the cherry red, the little daisy in the basket, the streamers curling off the handles, she went completely still. Completely, entirely still. She put both hands over her mouth exactly the way her mother had. And then the smile came. It wasn't a small smile. It wasn't a polite smile. It was the kind of smile that happens when a child's whole heart is involved, wide and bright and completely out of control, spreading across her entire face until her eyes crinkled and her cheeks pressed up, and you could see every single baby tooth she had. She turned and threw herself at him. She wrapped her arms around his neck, both arms full force, the way children hug when they mean it with everything they have, and she pressed her face against his shoulder, and she said, in a voice muffled by his jacket, "Thank you, Daddy." And Adrian Cole, who had not been held in longer than he could remember, who had not been called that, who had spent 15 years deciding that the soft places inside him were weaknesses to be sealed and managed, felt something give way. Not break. Give way. The way a dam gives way in spring. Not violently, but inevitably. The way something that has been held too long finally finds the path through. His arms came up around her. Slowly.
Carefully.
Like he was holding something he understood, for the first time, was irreplaceable. He held her. He looked up, over her shoulder at Lena. Lena was crying. She wasn't trying to hide it anymore. The tears were moving quietly down her face, and she wasn't wiping them, and her eyes were on him with an expression that was so open and unguarded it was almost hard to look at. Gratitude and grief, and something that had been growing in the margins of her careful, measured awareness of this man for weeks now. Something she hadn't let herself name. He looked at her. Really looked at her. The way he had been carefully not doing. Mia leaned back in his arms and put both small hands on his cheeks, the way children do, completely unself-conscious, holding his face still so she could look at him properly. She studied him. "Don't be lonely anymore," she said.
Soft. Certain.
Like a verdict. He looked at this 3-year-old. This small, catastrophically perceptive person who had walked into his life and dismantled it, piece by piece, drawing by drawing, until the cold architecture of it had simply lost its grip on him. "I'll try," he said. And it came out so much quieter than his voice usually was. So much less defended. Mia nodded, satisfied. Then she wriggled down because the tricycle was right there and there was no more time for philosophy. She circled it, touched the bell, rang it once, a bright, sharp ding that echoed off the walls, and looked up at both of them with enormous delight. Lena laughed. It broke out of her, surprised and wet and real, and she pressed her fingers to her eyes. Adrian stood up. He stood in that small apartment with its paper stars and its little cot and its one window full of gray November light, and he looked at this woman who had kept herself so carefully intact, so professionally contained, so determined not to ask anything of the world that the world hadn't already agreed to give her. "She deserves a real party," he said quietly. "If you'll let me." Lena looked at him. "Mr. Cole." "Adrian," he said. Simply. Finally. She was quiet for a moment. She looked at Mia, who was now sitting on the tricycle in the middle of the apartment, ringing the bell with pure religious joy. She looked back at him. "Adrian," she said softly, like a test. like a beginning. He almost smiled. It was small, just a shift at the corner of his mouth, the reluctant arrival of an expression he hadn't made in so long the muscles were unfamiliar with it. But it was real. Absolutely real. The kind of smile that comes not from charm or performance, but from something that has broken through from somewhere deep, somewhere that has been sealed for years and has finally found its way to air. Mia rang the bell again. And the sound of it, small and clear and completely unself-conscious, filled every room of that house that had been quiet for too long. Some walls don't come down because someone knocks them down. They come down because a 3-year-old in yellow duck pajamas decides, with the unshakable certainty of a child who doesn't yet know the world is supposed to be harder than this, that the person on the other side of that wall needed to be found. Mia Martinez found Adrian Cole, and in doing so, she found exactly what she had always asked for. A daddy who showed up. The end.